I'm 32 years old, my name is Aurora, and my profession has long since transformed my life into a series of hotel corridors and train station forms. I represent a large company on the road. My workdays are measured in kilometers and schedules, and home for me often means nothing more than a bag left on the second shelf in the apartment where I return between flights for a brief, precious moment to feel like a person, not a collection of documents and business cards. This rented apartment, where I've lived for years now and which at first seemed like a temporary respite, has turned into a small punishment, thin walls through which other people's stories echo, as if the paper windows let in, not light, but endless noise. Screams, the screaming television, children's voices that tear at my fragile peace. And every time I return from exhausting business trips, I want only one thing: peace and quiet. But instead, I get a migraine from the noise of others, and it feels as if these four walls have absorbed everyone else's bustle like a sponge. I saved money slowly but deliberately, like collecting seeds for the future, and finally decided that I'd had enough of that room where I had no real yard, no corner where I could be alone without hearing the neighbors' dramas. I didn't need a luxurious mansion. I needed a regular house with a yard, where I could open the window and listen to the earth breathe, where I could put a chair on the porch and not worry about another spectacle of someone else's life beginning behind the wall. I dialed my friend, Arnaldo, a longtime realtor who knows where to find such simple conveniences, and calmly, in a business-like tone, told him what I was looking for: a medium-sized house, not on a busy main road with a spacious yard and decent neighbors. He promised to look at options and call back, saying he'd let me know as soon as he found suitable properties, and I, in turn, with a rare relief, allowed myself to think about what the morning would smell like in the new house. While Arnaldo was browsing listings and arranging showings, another thought was nagging at me. I'd been wanting to visit my parents for a long time, and although I always tell myself I should come more often, my constant travels make such visits a rare treat in my schedule. Their house is small, old, on the other side of town, and that day, Inez's sister's car was parked in the driveway. She's 2 years older than me, married to Stefano, and almost always shows up at her parents' house with her children, 6-year-old Filippo and 4-year-old Sarah, because Mom and Dad practically help her raise the little ones. I walked in and saw a scene familiar from childhood. Filippo was driving a toy car across the carpet, doing broom broom. Sarah, with the seriousness of a little artist, was coloring something. Inez had settled down on the sofa with a tired look. Stefano was silently on the phone, and Mom was finishing up dinner. Afterward, we sat down to eat, and as usual, the conversation again revolved around Inez and her children. Mom admired how Filippo had become smarter and was already trying to read. Dad teased Sarah, getting her to quietly laugh, and Inez complained about how everything was getting more expensive. Groceries, children's clothes, everything. I, slowly stirring the mashed potatoes in my bowl, was looking for my moment to intervene. A pause formed when Filippo accidentally knocked over his glass, spilling juice across the tablecloth. At that moment, I decided I couldn't remain silent any longer, that I needed to say directly and calmly what had been brewing for a long time. I have news. I'm planning to buy a house. My words were followed by a deathly silence, as if someone had suddenly closed an old book of family expectations. Little Filippo was still fussing with his spilled drink, but the others turned to me, and the expressions on their faces were clear. Not joy or surprise, but something else. Inez wore an expression I didn't recall from childhood, a mixture of irritation and jealousy, as if my single phrase had violated her rights and plans. Mom put down her fork and said, in the same tone she'd used to admonish us as children when we'd done something she considered unworthy, "A home? Aurora, why do you need a home? You're always on the move. What's the point? You can keep renting." And Inez immediately chimed in, speaking as if defending not only her own needs, but also some kind of natural justice. She needed a home more. She had children. Children needed space, and I was just one person who was hardly even home. I tried to object, But Dad merely nodded, as if confirming that common sense was on his and his daughter's side. And then, in the stern voice he used when we found ourselves in awkward situations as children, he uttered words that shattered something inside me like a splinter. "You don't have a family. You don't have children. You work constantly and can't even keep a boyfriend long enough to settle down. Inez needs this house more than you do." It felt like I'd woken up in some crazy dream where all the laws of common sense had been turned upside down, and I heard my own voice from afar, as if someone were speaking through a glass. "Are you serious right now?" And this question sounded both surprise and reproach and mistrust at the same time. "I'm buying this house with my own money, which I earned," I answered, calmer than I felt, because I instantly understood that I was not going to give in and that my years of labor, those sleepless evenings and mornings in hotel rooms, salaries subject to strict accounting, and the painful habit of saving for later, all this should not dissolve in someone else's ideas of justice, where the right to a roof over one's head is distributed not according to merit, but according to whoever shouts the loudest in the family circle. Mom, with her eternal knack for citing truisms, "family should help family," said this phrase as if a single argument was enough for her to close all the doors and leave me outside, while Inez, relying on the vulnerable truth about children, said that she was suffering and that she was the one who needed the house. I listened and felt not so much anger as shame flare up inside. A strange, absurd feeling when your own determination suddenly turns into a violation of the family contract, a manifestation of selfishness. "Inez is suffering with 2 small children," she repeated in the tone a mother uses when she wants her daughter's word to carry weight, and I sighed deeply because I saw behind these words not only the truth about her fatigue, but also a trump card, with which she now sought to close my walls and leave with the keys to my future home. "I won't give up my house to anyone," I said, my voice growing louder because there was nowhere else to condense this pent-up tension. "I worked hard for this. I saved for years. It's my dream, and I'm making it come true." My words held pain, pride, and the weariness of someone who had spent their entire adult life calculating every step, rather than begging for favors from their loved ones. Papa blushed, as if his weariness with the centuries of existence had suddenly turned him pale, and gathering sternness, he said, "You're selfish, Aurora. You live alone. You have no responsibilities other than work. You can live perfectly well in this apartment." His words betrayed both disappointment and the age-old habit of judging by standards he considered immutable. I couldn't stand the silence and got up from the table, because remaining in that space where the voices seemed like a death sentence was no longer possible. "I think you're all crazy," I said, and these words sounded not like proud reproach, but pure despair, because I truly didn't understand why my dream had to be subject to public scrutiny. "That's madness," I added, and stepped into the guest room, where my purse and a bag of things I usually carried on trips and kept ready, like trophies of my own independence, were already packed. I heard their accelerated conversation coming from the dining room, the words sliding and clattering against the old walls, probably discussing how much of a terrible person I was in their new version of reality, and my resolute silence became the final touch to a picture I no longer wanted to remain in. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, and my mother called out to me in that mixed tone that combined reproach and pleading, "Aurora, where are you going?" "We haven't finished talking about this yet." "Yes, that's true," I said without turning around, because I had already decided I was done, and an inner voice told me that discussing my life with those who were ready to decide for you was pointless. "Don't you dare abandon us!" Inez screamed, and her voice was so full of panic and resentment, as if I wasn't just leaving, but betraying their entire family matrix. "We are your family," she added, and for a second I saw in this statement both the ancient truth and the instrument through which they were now demanding a redistribution of my future. But I was already in the car, starting the engine, and I felt my hand tremble and my knees tremble, not from fear, but from the release of tension. I left their house and drove straight to my noisy apartment, shaking the entire way, not from the journey, but from what had just happened and from the fact that I'd decided to do what I'd dreamed of for so long. When I got home, my phone was already vibrating like crazy. Missed calls from my mom, dad, and Inez. They wanted to drag me back into the conversation, to defuse the conflict, but I ignored them all and went straight to bed, although I barely slept. My dad kept repeating himself in my head, his words, "You don't deserve a home, you don't have children," seemed to be etched into my consciousness, interfering with my rest. The next morning, there were a ton of messages. My mom sent a long text full of accusations. "Aurora, you're selfish and cruel. Family helps family. Inez needs this home for her children." Dad wrote briefly, "Call us back. We need to talk about this properly." And a whole stream of messages came from Inez, calling me heartless, soulless, indifferent to my nephews, and it all felt like torture, with tiny pricks that don't leave wounds but don't let you live. I deleted all the messages without replying because I needed to focus on work. In a few days, another business trip, reports on the desk, deals, flights. But after 2 weeks, not a word from the family had come. And frankly, I felt a little better. I was just starting to get back into my usual rhythm when Arnaldo called, "Aurora, I found something perfect for you." His voice trembled with excitement, and as he started listing the features of the place, I felt hope bloom inside me. A 3-bedroom house, a large backyard, a quiet street, good neighbors. The owners are in a hurry, moving to another state, and the best part is, they're leaving behind quality furniture. That Saturday, he picked me up and drove me to the house, and as soon as I saw it, I knew without a doubt that it was exactly what I was looking for. Not too big, not pretentious, with white siding, a red front door, and a yard filled with old oak trees, providing shade and promising that in the mornings, only the sound of birdsong would be heard, not the squabbles of others. And when we walked inside, I felt that the furniture was high quality and homey, that the kitchens with granite countertops and spacious, bright bedrooms were all designed for a peaceful life, and the neighbors, who turned out to be friendly, seemed like that rare case where a home not only protects, but also welcomes. "How much were they asking?" I asked, and Arnaldo quoted a price that fit right into my budget, allowing me to make a decent down payment and leave a little money for unnecessary surprises. I began, and the word proposal burst out of me with determination, because the fatigue of compromise was suddenly replaced by a sense of entitlement to my own life, and the landlords accepted my offer that very day. 3 weeks later, I was already signing the papers and receiving the keys, and I couldn't believe how quickly it all happened, as if the universe itself had thrown me a gift in response to years of patience. I became a homeowner. I had my own yard, silence, and no one breathing in unison with me through the thin walls, and I decided not to tell anyone. After that family dinner disaster, I recognized that people who are willing to devalue your dream don't deserve to know about it first. I didn't even plan to invite them to the housewarming. Why did I need people who thought I didn't deserve my own home? Moving day was amazing, and even though I didn't have much stuff, the house was rented furnished after all. I still hired movers because I wanted the moment to pass calmly, without unnecessary hassle, as if the move itself were a rite of passage into a new life, where I no longer had to lug heavy bags upstairs and break my back for every suitcase. For the first week, I wandered through the rooms, touching countertops, cabinet handles, sofas, curtains, still not quite believing that all of this was now mine, that these walls would no longer steal my sleep with the loud voices of my neighbors, and that I could sit in the backyard with a cup of morning coffee and hear the chirping of birds instead of the roar of cars, and fall asleep at night in such silence that the earplugs that had been my obligatory companion for so many years could now be safely thrown away. However, I barely had time to enjoy this new peace before I went on another business trip, and the house had to be left empty, as if it were learning to live without me. But when I returned 2 weeks later, I knew it was time to celebrate. I threw a housewarming party, invited colleagues and friends, and the evening was wonderful. We grilled burgers in the backyard, laughed, listened to music, and everyone told me how happy they were for me, how proud they were that I'd decided to take this step, and their words contained exactly the warmth I'd longed to hear back then at my parents' table, but hadn't. I walked among the guests, smiling, showing them the rooms, and a feeling of happiness and pride grew within me. Here it was, my home, and here were people who truly cared about me. Around 8 o'clock, in the midst of the festivities, with music blasting from the speakers and someone already reaching for seconds, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I went to see who it was. And when I opened the door, I was almost speechless. My parents, Inez and Stefano, stood there, dressed up as if they were invited guests, too. "Surprise?" my mother drawled with a smile that seemed painted on, not real. "We found you. What are you doing here?" "How did you get this address?" I breathed out, trying to comprehend what was happening. My mother waved her hand as if it were nothing. "Oh, we have our own customs. Aren't you going to invite us?" Before I could even respond, they passed me by and I stood in the doorway, mouth open, watching my family march into my living room as if it had always been my right. I immediately thought that one of my cousins or aunts, whom I had innocently told about the purchase, must have given them the address. I should have been more careful, but it was too late. As soon as they entered, I seemed to see completely different people standing before me. Mom began showering my friends with compliments, admiring how proud she was of me. "Look what our Aurora has accomplished. We're so happy for her. She worked so hard for this beautiful house." While Dad cheerfully shook my colleagues' hands and assured them that he always knew I would do great things because they raised me right. I wanted to scream, because these were the same people who had recently been telling me I had no right to a house, that I had no family, and therefore I was unworthy of a roof over my head. Meanwhile, Inez and Stefano had split up and were wandering around the house. I followed Inez upstairs and found her in my bedroom. She was opening a closet, peering into the bathroom, as if testing everything. Stefano was downstairs, examining the kitchen, opening cabinets, touching the appliances. I had the feeling they were exploring the house not out of curiosity, but to memorize every detail, as if the house somehow belonged to them. I felt terribly awkward, but I couldn't make a scene in front of my colleagues, so I watched silently as they played the role of a loving and proud family for about an hour. When they were about to leave because it's time for the kids to go to bed, my mother turned to me and gave me a look full of disappointment. "You should be ashamed, Aurora. Not inviting your own family to the housewarming party. Don't even tell us you bought a house." "That's wrong," Dad added sternly. "They had to hear it from others, and that's no way to treat parents." But I didn't feel ashamed. On the contrary, I was relieved when they finally left, and the rest of the party was much more fun without their shadow. Friends discussed among themselves why my family seemed so strange and fake, and although I hated hearing these words, I knew they were right. After the party, I decided it was time to work on the yard. I dreamed of having my own garden my whole life, but there wasn't a single inch of land in my apartment. Now I had a huge backyard full of possibilities, and I spent my weekends planting flowers, pulling weeds, trimming branches, and enjoying every moment outdoors in my own space. That's when I met Mrs. Esposito, my neighbor. One Saturday, she was pottering around in her garden, and I was struggling with a stubborn rose bush when her voice rang out through the fence. "You need to trim it back even more. Don't worry." I looked up and saw a sweet elderly woman with white hair, soil on her gardening gloves, strong and healthy despite her age, which I estimated to be somewhere around 70. "I'm Aurora," I said, stepping closer to the fence. "I recently moved here." "I'm Calvina Esposito, but you can call me Mrs. Esposito," she replied with a smile. We struck up a conversation, and I told her about my work and how often I traveled for work, and she, being kind and attentive, offered to watch the house while I was gone. We exchanged phone numbers, and I felt so warm knowing that someone nearby could be trusted with the keys to the peace of my new home. 2 months later, my house had become a true refuge for me, and my love for it grew stronger with each passing day. Morning coffee on the veranda, rustling branches, the warm light in the windows in the evening, the rare, saving silence that brought back forgotten childhood memories. But life didn't stop, and I was sent on another 2-week business trip, so with a slight trepidation and a sense of responsibility for this new space, I asked Mrs. Esposito to look after the house and the plants, assuring myself that I was leaving it in good hands. The first week passed without incident, and I had almost stopped worrying. But on Wednesday of the second week, around 11 o'clock in the evening, the phone woke me up in the hotel. A familiar number was on the screen, and Mrs. Esposito's voice, quiet and worried, said, "Aurora, dear, I'm sorry to call so late, but there's someone in your house. I see light and hear music." And at that moment my heart sank, because there was no logic in it. But the neighbor's voice did not lend itself to simple, dismissive rationalization. I tried to calm down and think rationally. Perhaps Mrs. Esposito had gotten confused. Perhaps she'd seen a reflection in the window or heard music in the distance. But when, in response to my words that no one could possibly be in the house, she said coldly, "If you don't believe me, I won't tell you anything else," and hung up. Only the hum of my own thoughts echoed in the hotel's silence, leaving a strange feeling of powerlessness. I finished my business trip and returned home, expecting to have my mistrust justified. But there were no signs of forced entry. Everything was in its place. The house looked as if it had never been visited. I felt ashamed in front of Mrs. Esposito, so the next morning I bought a pie and went to her to apologize. She greeted me calmly, merely asking me to sit down and showing me the recording she'd made that night. A dark, grainy video of lights shining in the windows of my house and shadowy figures moving in the background, and the frame, though blurry, unsettled me. We tried to make out faces, but the video was too bad, and in dismay, I sent the file to myself and returned to the house in a state of nervous tension, wondering how someone could have gotten in without breaking anything or leaving any obvious traces. That same day, I contacted a security company, and a technician promised to install hidden cameras around the perimeter and one in the living room by morning, explaining that they would be small and discreet, but would provide a clear picture on an app on my phone. The next day, the cameras were indeed installed. The technician carefully adjusted the angles, hid the cables, and found the optimal locations. When I first watched the feed, I saw a crystal clear picture of every corner of the house and felt a distinct sense of relief, as if someone had finally erected an invisible, controllable fence around my life. A month passed, and I almost allowed myself to believe it was an isolated and incomprehensible incident, after which I was sent on my way again, and I left calmly, leaving Mrs. Esposito on guard. But 3 days later, late in the evening, her voice rang out again. "Aurora, I see people in your house again. I hear music and voices." And my heart pounding, I opened the app and froze, because there were people sitting on the screen in the living room, and they weren't strangers. My parents, Inez and Stefano, and guests next to them, apparently Inez's friends, 8 people in total, laughing, raising glasses, making toasts, and acting as if the house was familiar and theirs. Stefano was standing behind my bar as if it were his workspace, expertly mixing cocktails. Dad was comfortably settled in my favorite chair, occupying the position I'd always considered exclusively mine. And Mom was in the kitchen, apparently using my utensils to serve food. My first reaction was to lose it, call my parents and sister, and yell at them to get out of my house immediately. But the rage and humiliation that overwhelmed me were so intense that I decided a simple scream wasn't enough. They deserved far worse punishment, and my hand trembled with anger as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and businesslike, and I exhaled. "There are intruders in my house right now. I'm out of town on a business trip, but I can see through the security cameras that people have broken into my house and are throwing a party in my living room. Can you see what's happening in real time, ma'am? The dispatcher asked, and I, staring at the screen where my walls reflected the alien laughter, said, "Yes, I have video surveillance installed. I can see them right now." There are about 8 of them there, drinking, dancing, having fun. Officers have already been dispatched. Stay on the line and keep monitoring the cameras. Every detail is important to us, a calm voice replied, and I, clinging to this instruction, continued to watch my parents, my sister and her husband, and their friends act as if everything here belonged to them. About 10 minutes later, I saw police cars pull up to the house, their headlights illuminating the facade, and 2 officers climbed the steps to my door and began knocking loudly. Everything inside froze, the music stopped, the laughter died down, and I watched as Stefano, looking around nervously, walked to the door, opened it, and began waving his arms hastily, explaining something to the officers. They entered, and a conversation began in which my parents and Ines looked shocked, and their guests looked frightened and confused. One officer was taking down the statement, another was asking questions, and everything was going more or less calmly until Stefano, clearly drunk, suddenly lost control and started screaming, pointing his finger right in the officer's face. I heard the dispatcher say into the phone, "Madam, one of them is acting aggressively toward our officers. We're calling for backup." And on the screen I saw Stefano attempt to push the officer, after which he was immediately subdued, handcuffed and resisting, shouting something unintelligible, but my cameras didn't pick up the audio. Soon additional cars arrived. Officers escorted all the guests outside, and I watched as my sister, crying and pleading, and my parents, their faces white, were bundled into cars. Stefano, handcuffed, cursed and thrashed until he was taken away separately. Half an hour later, the phone rang. "Miss Aurora, this is Officer Martinez." The voice introduced itself. "We have detained several individuals we found in your home. They claim they were there with your permission, that you gave them the keys yourself. Is this true?" "Absolutely not," I replied coldly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've never allowed anyone into my house, never given anyone keys." "This is trespassing. They claim to be your family and that there was a misunderstanding," he continued. "They are my family, but that doesn't give them the right to invade my life. I want them punished to the fullest extent of the law," I said firmly. "We'll detain them overnight, and tomorrow you can come to the station and file a formal report," the officer replied and hung up. And then my phone literally exploded. First my parents called, then Ines, but I didn't answer either call. Then the messages started pouring in. My mother wrote that they were at the police station, that I should tell them it was all a misunderstanding, and to call back immediately. My father, always straightforward, wrote, "This is ridiculous. Tell the police you gave us permission to use the house." And Ines sent at least 10 messages in a row, each one laced with accusations. "I can't believe you called the police on your own family. My children are with Stefano's parents and I can't contact them. You're ruining our lives." I read each message and, to my surprise, began to laugh, though the laughter was bitter, like a lump of pain in my throat. They seriously thought I'd drop everything, side with them, and lie to the police, getting them out of trouble after what they'd done to me and my home, but I knew for sure. No way, never. Then I dialed my boss and, trying to keep my voice collected, explained that I had a serious family emergency and needed to return home earlier than planned. Fortunately, he was understanding, saying my assistant would handle the rest of the trip and wishing me well. The next day, I flew home, my heart pounding like I was going into battle, and took the first car home. When I opened the door, the smell of stale alcohol and cheap food hit me, and the scene that met my eyes was horrific. Glasses strewn everywhere, greasy stains and crumbs on the sofa and armchairs, the kitchen littered with empty bottles and dirty dishes. I realized they hadn't had a moment to clean up, as the police had caught them off guard, so I went straight to the station. In the detention room, I saw them all at once, my parents, Ines and Stefano, their faces tired and gray, clearly having spent the night in a cell. As soon as I stepped through the door, they all started talking at once, interrupting each other, as if hoping to shout me down and convince me otherwise. "Aurora, thank God you're here," my mother said hurriedly, holding out her arms, but I remained motionless. "Tell them it's a mistake. Explain it to them," my father interjected in the authoritative tone that had always made me tremble as a child, but now only strengthened my resolve. Inez was sobbing, her shoulders shaking. "My children are calling me. I need to go home. To them, please help me." Stefano remained silent, looking at me with cloudy, bloodshot eyes full of malice. I turned to the investigator and said clearly, word by word, "I want to clarify once again that I never gave any of these people permission to be in my house. I never handed over the keys. They somehow entered illegally and were throwing parties there in my absence." I watched my parents' faces turn white, as if they'd realized this was serious. Inez's tears deepened, and Stefano's gaze grew so dark that for a moment I felt a chill down my spine. My father tried to prevail. "Aurora, stop this nonsense. Tell them the truth. You gave us the keys. You were just angry over something trivial." But I firmly replied, "No, I'm telling the truth. They broke into my house." The officer nodded and said calmly, "We need you to sign the papers, then we'll proceed with the charges." I signed everything, but when it came to the question of punishment, despite my resentment, I couldn't bring myself to demand the harshest outcome. My little nephews' faces were in my head, and I asked the officer if my family could be released on bail. And so it was. They were released, but the investigation wasn't closed, and the consequences still caught up with them. A few days later, the police called me and told me something even more terrifying than I'd imagined. The officer explained that my sister had been making molds of my keys during my housewarming party, using some kind of soft plastic, and then ordered duplicates. That's how they were able to enter my house as if it were their rightful place. I could hardly believe that Inez, the same girl I'd walked hand in hand with to school, had planned everything so far in advance. Moreover, they had information about my work schedule, and it turned out that my sister's friend worked in HR at my company and had been telling her when I would be away. In the end, my family didn't go to jail, but the fines were enormous. Inez lost friends. Everyone who was at the party turned against her, blaming her for dragging them into the scandal. Stefano was fired from his job because his misconduct was reported to his superiors. My parents called me for weeks, leaving dozens of messages, but I didn't answer a single one, and I deleted Inez's long letters, in which she tried to blame me for the destruction of her marriage and her entire life, without reading beyond the first lines. I changed the locks, installed a new, much more reliable alarm system, and suddenly felt my home become even dearer to my heart, because now it was mine alone, protected, inviolable. Mrs. Esposito, my neighbor, became even closer. She was deeply upset that she hadn't recognized my family that day and been unable to warn me in time. But I reassured her, repeating, "Don't blame yourself. I couldn't imagine my family capable of such a thing." And it was true. Now I don't speak to my parents or my sister at all because what they did is unforgivable. They secretly made copies of my keys, turned my house into their party venue, and behind my back they told me I didn't deserve to have my own place. Thinking about it gives me a chill, but at the same time, I love my home even more than before. It's my refuge now, my fortress, and there's always someone who truly cares for me. Mrs. Esposito, a true friend who watches over my house and me.